Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the definitions of citizenship. In Suzanne Ovalaire's introductory chapter in the book Latinos and Citizenship, she makes a distinction between legal understandings and social understandings of citizenship. Legal understandings focus on an individual's legal status in the country and the political rights they have access to, like voting. Whereas social understandings are based on how immigrants see themselves in relation to the United States, their everyday experiences of contributing to society and feeling like they belong to their communities. Now, the reading talks a little bit of sort of the racial history of the United States in terms of how race has been defined through different laws and different court cases that kind of keep moving the needle in terms of who's allowed in and who's not. So one of the first laws that the United States passed was the Naturalization Law of 1790, which granted citizens to whites born in the United States and limited naturalization to immigrants who were free white persons. The Dred Scott case denied African-American citizenship rights in 1857, but the 1866 Civil Rights Act reversed the Dred Scott case, granting African-American citizenship. However, the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896 limited what those citizenship rights were going to be by legalizing segregation. We also see sort of this moving needle of racial inclusion or exclusion in citizenship in the experiences of different Asian Americans who have sought citizenship in the United States. In Takao Ozawa versus the United States, the court determined that despite Japanese-born Takao Ozawa's white skin, he was not white because he was not Caucasian. He argued that his skin was white and therefore should be allowed to become a citizen. The court said that white meant Caucasian. But then in the United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind case, the court argued just months later after the Ozawa case that even though Asian Indians, such as Bhagat Singh Thind, were Caucasian, they were not white. So his argument was that his people came from a part of the Caucasus, and that the people who come from that area are called Caucasians, which meant that by definition, he was Caucasian. The court said that he could not have citizenship because he was not white. We continue to also see this shift in understanding of citizenship through the civil rights era to a lived experience of social rights. So it wasn't just what did the law say about what rights you had if you were a citizen, but what were the social rights that people had, like not being able to live together, not being able to use the same water fountain, right? So they shifted the conversation of citizenship to talk about social rights, not just legal rights. We also see this within the feminist movement, where women were demanding rights beyond the right to vote. And then the reading also talked about how different groups of people have second-class citizenship, as we saw in the cases of Hurricanes Katrina and Maria. And in the supplemental videos, there are a couple of short videos about Hurricane Katrina and Maria that really depict what does this second-class citizenship look like for African Americans and Puerto Ricans. So this quote from the reading really sort of asks this question of who gets to define citizenship and belonging? What does it mean in the current context of globalization and the consequent changing nature of the state to belong to a national community of citizens? Who belongs and how do people experience their belonging today? How do we even know that we belong? Who determines who can and will be part of a national community and on what grounds? As the reading explains, Latinxes have consistently expressed their agency in deciding how citizenship and belonging are defined. Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans which were given American citizenship as a result of war and colonization, consistently emphasize their long history of belonging to the United States as citizens. Immigrants, whether undocumented or not, have stood up against injustice, as seen in the 2006 protests across the country against the anti-immigrant laws proposed by Sensenbrenner. And finally, transnational relationships and dual citizenships allow Latinxes to think of citizenship belonging in broader terms that crosses national boundaries. In the next article by Renato Rosaldo, he argues that citizenship is always informed by culture. So, for instance, he talks about the culture of militarization and how that culture influences policies on border policing. We also see in examples of propositions put forth in California in the 1990s, people voted their cultural biases. He also talks about Latino cultural citizenship, how Latinos themselves use their cultural values of respect, recognition, and dignity to claim rights, and talks about this kind of citizenship as a vernacular notion of citizenship. Finally, the last reading by Rincon and Oboler that discuss how Latinx literature represents the various experiences of Latinx populations in finding and defining citizenship and belonging for themselves. The very earliest novel that did this was Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton's novel, The Squatter and the Don, which documents the shift in citizenship from Mexico to the United States after the US and Mexico War, and how, despite the promises of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the government of California passed its own laws that led to the loss of land by Californians. While Ruiz de Burton represents a perspective of the elites, Gloria Anzaldúa, through her depiction of La Frontera, represents a perspective from a Chicana marginalized by race, class, and sexuality. Puerto Rican authors like Esmeralda Santiago and Abraham Rodriguez depict the problems of colonial citizenship for Puerto Ricans both in the US and the island, right? And giving sort of examples of how these different kinds of institutions like education, schools, are a function of inculcating colonial citizenship into the minds of young people, both on the island and in the United States. Authors like Richard Rodriguez and Braulio Munoz depict the cost of choosing assimilation as a path to belonging, whereas novels like Down These Mean Streets by Piri Tomás represents delinquent citizenship. And this is a concept created by scholar Monica Brown, and that describes delinquent citizenship and that experience in this way. And here I'm quoting from the reading: as criminalized youth of color experience the brunt of social disempowerment, some form gangs that ironically mimic nationalist practices, rituals, and sentiments. Brown argues that young Latino gang members often assert an alternative citizenship in a counter nation, one that fulfills fundamental needs not accorded by the state, including economic security and communal belonging. So in Piri Tomás's experience, this is actually a memoir, Down These Mean Streets. He is an Afro-Puerto Rican who is living in the 1940s and the 1950s in Spanish Harlem in New York. And as a Black Puerto Rican man, he is consistently experiencing being excluded both for being Puerto Rican and for being Black, right? And so he finds a sense of community by joining a gang, right, and sort of depicting that particular experience. So it's interesting, this additional concept of citizenship as delinquent citizenship, and a different way to look at why do people join certain types of organizations and groups. Ernesto Quiñones' novel Chango's Fire depicts examples of cultural citizenship as discussed by Renato Rosaldo, through the character of Maritza, who creates a sense of community for her Central American and Mexican congregants in her church. So the church becomes a sort of safe space in which these immigrants can find a sense of belonging and a sense of community. The reading also talks about Central American, Cuban, and Dominican writers and how they depict how the politics of the United States and Latin America define who is a refugee or exile, and how these different definitions of these two states of being in the United States impact the sense of belonging for these populations in the US. And finally, she discusses The Brief Runner's Life of Oscar Wilde, of a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Junot Díaz, as an example of transnational citizenship, where this kind of citizenship challenges the institution of citizenship itself through the transnational back and forth movement of immigrants, economic remittances, and dual citizenships that some of these immigrants are granted by their home nations, and how this allows Latinx populations an alternative way of defining citizenship and belonging that is not limited to US national borders. So we're going to be discussing all these different definitions of citizenship, all these different experiences of citizenship and belonging through a number of different novels, focusing on the experiences of Latinx women in particular, and how gender adds, right, an element to how belonging and citizenship are defined and experienced in the United States. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts on the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.